now know that at that time, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, truly global cataclysmic events involving rapid rises in sea level.
For centuries, Noah's Ark belonged to the world of faith, not archaeology. Then a team arrived in eastern Turkey with ground-penetrating radar.
I'm getting a massive anomaly right here.
3D imaging and technology built to see beneath the earth.
Researchers in Turkey now claim they found indisputable evidence that the story of Noah's Ark was not a cautionary tale about the consequences of forsaking God, but a verifiable historical event.
What they found was not proof, but something equally compelling. Buried beneath the Durupinar formation were patterns they could not easily explain, reopening one of history's oldest and most controversial mysteries. The shape in the earth. The site rests on the rugged slopes of Mount Tenderek in eastern Turkey, not far from the better-known Mount Ararat. It is an unforgiving landscape of volcanic rock, steep ridges, and barren terrain. Winters are severe, summers are dry, and the region remains isolated even today. It is the kind of place where an unusual formation could remain largely undisturbed for centuries, even millennia, without attracting sustained attention from the outside world. For generations, local villagers pointed to one particular formation and repeated the same story they had inherited from those before them. Long before satellite imagery or aerial photography, they believed the shape on the mountainside was no ordinary feature of the landscape. When viewed from above, it is difficult to ignore why. The outline forms a remarkably symmetrical oval stretching more than 500 feet in length, with one end tapering to a point and the other curving into a broad stern. Its proportions resemble the hull of a massive ship rather than the irregular contours normally produced by volcanic geology. At over 500 feet long, it is comparable to a modern skyscraper laid horizontally across the mountainside, resting hundreds of miles from the nearest sea. Today, the location is known as the Durupinar Formation, named after the Turkish military officer who photographed it from the air in 1959 while conducting an aerial survey. His photographs briefly attracted international attention. Investigators traveled to the site, examined the visible evidence, and reached a familiar conclusion. They classified it as a natural geological formation, the product of erosion and volcanic processes. Interest faded, public attention shifted elsewhere, and the mountain remained exactly as it had been before. Yet the site has never completely disappeared from the conversation. Researchers, explorers, and independent investigators have continued returning, each convinced that the formation deserves another look. Whether they arrive hoping to confirm or dismiss extraordinary claims, they encounter the same central question. Whatever produced a shape with such striking proportions in such an unlikely location demands an explanation. And for many who have examined the evidence closely, none of the explanations offered so far has fully settled the matter. What the modern team found. The difference between every previous investigation of this site and the current one is the tools. Earlier researchers arrived with what was available to them: shovels, surface observation, physical samples taken from what they could reach. The modern team arrived with something different. Ground-penetrating radar reads the ground the way an X-ray reads a body. It maps what hides beneath the surface without disturbing a single handful of soil. Combined with three-dimensional subsurface imaging, these instruments can build a picture of what lies 8 to 20 feet underground with a precision that no earlier generation of researchers had access to. The team expected what you typically find inside a geological formation on a volcanic slope: chaos, crumbled rock, jagged irregular layering, the random disordered mess that natural processes leave behind over thousands of years. That is not what the scans returned. What the instruments showed was long straight lines, clean angles, layered sections stacked in a way that suggested floors, symmetrical compartments spaced at regular intervals. These patterns extended 8 to 20 feet underground, well below the reach of surface erosion or any process that could have carved them from the top down. The significance of this is worth sitting with for a moment. Nature produces an enormous range of extraordinary shapes. It carves canyons. It builds mountains. It creates formations that can fool the eye for a second. But it almost never draws straight lines. Right angles and regular spacing are the fingerprints of intention. They are what appears when something is built, not when something forms naturally. The measurements of what the instruments found inside the formation aligned with dimensions recorded in the ancient biblical text. Not roughly. Close enough that the researchers went quiet about it in a way that was noticeable. Soil samples from inside the formation carried more organic material than samples taken from outside. The chemical signatures suggested that something once living had been present inside the formation and had broken down over a very long period of time. The mineral balance in the soil inside was different from the surrounding ground. Even the plants growing on the surface above the formation showed subtle differences from the vegetation around them. Near the site, researchers found massive stone slabs taller than a standing adult. Each of them had holes deliberately carved through the top section. The shape and placement of those holes matched the function of anchor stones, heavy weights used to steady a large vessel against a strong current. Locals said the stones had always been there. The team that conducted this investigation was careful about what they said afterward. They did not announce that they had found the Ark. What they said was something more measured and in some ways more unsettling. They said they could not explain what the instruments were showing them. The formation was not behaving like rock. The soil was not behaving like ordinary soil. The interior was not producing the kind of readings that a natural formation produces. The man who gave everything. Long before modern researchers arrived with ground-penetrating radar, subsurface imaging, and digital mapping technology, another man stood on the slopes of Mount Tenderek with little more than determination and an unshakable conviction. His name was Ron Wyatt. Wyatt was not a trained archaeologist. He held no academic degree in geology, archaeology, or biblical history. He worked as a nurse anesthetist in Tennessee, living an ordinary professional life far removed from universities, excavation teams, or research institutes. Yet after seeing an aerial photograph of the boat-shaped formation in a magazine during the late 1970s, he became convinced that it was the remains of Noah's Ark. What began as curiosity soon became a lifelong pursuit. Those who knew him often described his certainty as absolute. Once the idea took hold, it never left him. That conviction came at a considerable personal cost. For more than 2 decades, Wyatt returned to eastern Turkey again and again, financing much of his work himself. He invested countless hours, substantial personal resources, and much of his own reputation into a search that most professional archaeologists regarded with deep skepticism. While many considered the formation an unusual but natural geological structure, Wyatt believed the evidence pointed in another direction. Over the years, he reported a series of discoveries that, in his view, strengthened the case. He claimed to have identified petrified wooden remains embedded within the formation, metallic fasteners consistent with ancient ship construction, and regularly spaced rib-like structures tracing the outline of an enormous hull beneath the surface. He also pointed to several large standing stones nearby, commonly referred to as anchor stones, arguing that they belonged to the vessel. He believed the dimensions corresponded closely to the biblical description of the Ark, and he maintained that soil samples and chemical testing supported the conclusion that the site had once contained a massive wooden structure. These claims attracted a devoted following, but they also intensified criticism. Wyatt's investigations extended far beyond the Durupinar formation. Throughout his life, he announced discoveries of numerous biblical artifacts, including the Ark of the Covenant, the original stone tablets associated with Mount Sinai, the altar built by Moses, the sword of Goliath, and several other objects described in Scripture. Supporters viewed him as an independent explorer, willing to pursue questions that conventional archaeology either ignored or dismissed too quickly. Critics reached the opposite conclusion. They argued that Wyatt often approached sites with conclusions already formed and interpreted evidence through the lens of those expectations, rather than through controlled scientific investigation. The historical record leaves room for both observations. His field methods rarely followed the standards expected in professional archaeology. Many of his findings were not documented through peer-reviewed research, carefully controlled excavations, or independent verification. As a result, his conclusions were never widely accepted within the academic community. From the standpoint of scientific methodology, that skepticism was understandable. Extraordinary claims require evidence that can be tested, repeated, and confirmed by other investigators working independently. At the same time, it is also true that many of the technologies available to researchers today simply did not exist during Wyatt's investigations. Modern ground-penetrating radar, advanced geophysical imaging, high-resolution subsurface scanning, and sophisticated analytical techniques have transformed archaeological research in ways that were unavailable to him. He was attempting to answer questions using tools that were often limited by comparison with those available decades later. Ron Wyatt died in 1999, still convinced that the formation concealed the remains of Noah's Ark. He did not live to see renewed investigations or the application of technologies capable of examining the site without extensive excavation. Whether future research ultimately confirms or disproves his conclusions remains an open question. What cannot be disputed is that during a period when most of the world had lost interest, Wyatt refused to let the question disappear. His persistence kept attention focused on a site that might otherwise have faded entirely from public discussion, ensuring that later generations would return with better tools to ask the same question once again. 2,000 years of searching. The Durupinar site is one chapter in a much longer story. The search for Noah's Ark is one of the oldest sustained investigative efforts in human history, and it is littered with people who were absolutely certain they had found the answer, right up until they had not. The ancient historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, stated that pieces of the Ark were still present in Armenia, and that people collected fragments of it. Early Christian writers said the same thing. Medieval scholars and Islamic geographers across several centuries insisted the Ark was physical, was still up there somewhere, and that faithful people had seen it. The global spread of the flood story itself is one of the more remarkable features of the whole question. Versions of a great flood appear in roughly 200 cultures scattered across the entire planet. Different gods, different heroes, different names, but the same catastrophe at the center. A world drowned, a remnant saved, a beginning again. The ancient world was not just telling flood stories in parallel. In at least one documented case, a Babylonian clay tablet decoded by researcher Irving Finkel contained what appeared to be construction instructions for a flood vessel. Specific materials, specific dimensions, written down as if intended to be followed. The pattern of near misses runs through the modern era as relentlessly as through the ancient one. In 1876, an explorer named James Bryce found what he described as a carved wooden plank at 4,000 feet above the nearest tree line on Mount Ararat. He carried it down, convinced it was a piece of the Ark. The excitement drained away under skeptical examination. In 1949, United States intelligence photographs captured what appeared to be a dark shape on Ararat. Ark hunters studied the images closely. Nothing came of it. In 2003, a satellite image reignited the interest again with another shape that looked like a ship from altitude. Remote sensing specialists explained what they were actually seeing. The shape stayed unexplained for a week and then became ordinary. In 2010, a Hong Kong media group released footage claiming to show a team inside a wooden chamber high on the mountain. The story ran globally for a few days. Then observers noticed details in the footage that did not fit an ancient wooden structure. A local guide later claimed the chamber had been constructed specifically for the filming. The claim collapsed. Each cycle followed the same rhythm. Discovery, excitement, Announcement, examination, quiet, then the next one. For 2,000 years, the search ran almost entirely on belief and almost nothing else. Every generation got its moment of almost. Every claim got its headline. Every time, the same ending. Eyewitnesses with stories, photographs that blurred under scrutiny, gut feelings that evidence could not support, and faith that had to keep carrying a weight that data could not lift. The Black Sea Theory, the most credible scientific contribution to the flood question in recent decades, came not from a mountain in Turkey, but from the bottom of a sea. Robert Ballard is not a hopeful amateur with a theory. He is the explorer who located the actual wreck of the Titanic, not a rumor or a blurry sonar reading, but the ship itself, confirmed and documented. When someone with that record of precise discovery turned attention to the oldest flood tradition in human memory, the scientific community paid attention. The theory Ballard was investigating had been developed by researchers at Columbia University. Their argument was geological and historical. Thousands of years ago, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake. It sat in a basin ringed with early human settlements. The warming climate raised ocean levels. The rising Mediterranean pressed harder and harder against a natural land barrier at the Bosphorus Strait until the barrier gave way. The researchers argued that what followed was not a gradual rise, but something much more sudden. Salt water pouring into the freshwater basin at a volume they compared to many times the force of Niagara Falls, hour after hour. Land being swallowed quickly enough that people living on its edges would have watched the water coming and had to run. A catastrophe fast and violent enough to burn itself into memory and stay there. In 2012, Ballard took robotic submersibles into the Black Sea and found what he was looking for. About 400 feet down, an ancient shoreline sat sealed in place. The chemistry of the water in that part of the sea is unusual enough that organic material does not decay normally, and the shoreline was intact in a way that it would not be in ordinary ocean conditions. Carbon dating of shells from the old beach pointed to roughly 5000 BCE, landing squarely in the time window associated with flood traditions across multiple ancient cultures. Ballard said later that whatever happened in that basin was probably a very bad day for the people who were there. The artifacts that the submersibles retrieved from the deep sections suggested communities had been displaced fast by water that took everything they had. The question Ballard's team was not trying to answer was whether a single man named Noah built a boat in response. The question they were looking at was whether a catastrophic flood of the kind that could generate the tradition across 200 cultures had actually happened. A growing number of researchers began saying yes. The debate that followed split into three positions. Some researchers argued the Black Sea event was a genuine regional apocalypse, violent and sudden enough to drive a terror that traveled through oral tradition across millennia and across continents. Others accepted that a flood happened, but argued it was slower and less dramatic than the catastrophist version required. A third group maintained that even a gradual rise would not have been experienced as the kind of world-ending event the traditions describe. At that point, the debate stopped being purely about water. It became about memory itself, and about how a specific regional disaster could travel thousands of years and thousands of miles and grow in every telling into something that felt like the end of everything. A world divided by the same question. When the modern team's radar images and soil findings began circulating, the response split along lines that had been forming for a long time. For people who grew up on the story of Noah, the news hit like a childhood memory suddenly taking physical form. The familiar image of the wooden boat, the animals, the dove returning with a branch, abruptly given a shadow in the shape of a sonar reading on a mountainside in Turkey. Even the possibility changes something. It makes old stories feel less like comfortable inventions and more like things we are slowly remembering our way back toward. Scientists got cautious at exactly the point where almost everyone else got excited. Researchers argued over whether the subsurface patterns were genuinely structural, or whether certain geological processes could produce linear formations under specific conditions. Rock can fake a straight line under some circumstances. Sediment layers can create the appearance of regularity. Hope has fooled careful people before, and the history of this particular search is full of exactly that. Historians and religious scholars came at it from a third direction. Nearly every ancient civilization left behind a flood story. From the oldest Sumerian records to the earliest Hebrew writing, the catastrophic water event was threaded through the foundational stories of the ancient world. The question some historians were asking was not whether a boat could have survived intact for several thousand years on a volcanic slope in eastern Turkey, but what the near-universal presence of the flood tradition told us about actual history. Maybe the real discovery was not an object at all. Maybe it was a shared wound, a catastrophe so large that humanity has been carrying the memory of it across thousands of years because something genuinely happened. The public reaction pulled people who normally agree on almost nothing into the same conversation. People who had never read a word of archaeology squinted at radar scan images as if studying for an exam. Skeptics warned that excitement does not rewrite geology, and that wood from several thousand years ago should not have survived in recognizable form. Believers pointed back at the soil chemistry readings and the internal compartment patterns and the anchor stones and asked what natural process was supposed to account for all of it together. What the formation accomplished, whatever it eventually turns out to be, was to put people on opposite sides of a long-standing divide into the same room asking the same question. That by itself is a strange kind of evidence of how powerful the underlying story remains. Why people keep building it. While researchers debated what lay beneath the Durupinar formation, others chose a very different approach. Instead of waiting for archaeology to settle the question, they began building what the excavations had yet to confirm. Whether or not the Ark would ever be found, they wanted to understand its scale in the most tangible way possible. In the Netherlands, a Dutch builder undertook an extraordinary project. Using the dimensions recorded in the biblical account, he constructed a full-scale wooden replica of Noah's Ark. It was not a miniature display or a museum model. It was built at the size described in Genesis. Visitors could walk through its massive interior, climb its decks, and experience the immense proportions for themselves. Thousands traveled from across Europe, not simply to admire craftsmanship, but to stand inside a structure they had previously known only as words on a page. A similar vision emerged in the United States. In Kentucky, the Ark encounter opened to the public as one of the largest timber frame structures ever built. Constructed according to the biblical dimensions, it stretches hundreds of feet in length and rises above visitors with an overwhelming sense of scale. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people walk its corridors, gaze upward at its towering beams, and imagine what such a vessel would have looked like if it had truly existed. For many families, the experience transforms a familiar childhood story into something with physical weight and presence. Children who had only seen pictures suddenly grasp its size, while adults often discover that the dimensions described in Scripture are far larger than they had ever imagined. Projects like these are not built because the story is considered insignificant. They require enormous investments of time, engineering, labor, and money. They exist because countless people feel compelled to encounter the narrative in 3 dimensions, rather than through illustrations or imagination alone. There is something about occupying the same physical space, measuring the walls with your own steps, and standing beneath the height of the structure that satisfies a curiosity no painting or sermon can fully answer. Perhaps that is because the story of Noah has never been only about a boat. At its heart, it is a story about survival after overwhelming loss. It asks whether hope can endure when everything familiar has disappeared. It imagines a world reduced almost to nothing and then begins again with a single family, a fragile promise, and the possibility of renewal. Every generation recognizes something of itself in that pattern. Each era confronts its own floods, whether literal or symbolic. its own fears that the future may collapse under forces beyond human control. That is why an unusual shape on a mountainside in eastern Turkey continues to capture attention. It is more than a geological curiosity or an archaeological mystery. It represents one of humanity's oldest questions, repeated across cultures and centuries. When disaster comes, when the world seems ready to break apart, is there something that endures? Is there something capable of carrying life safely through the storm and into a new beginning? The question that is still open. The drilling at Durupinar is not finished. The analysis of the soil samples is not finished. The argument over what the subsurface patterns actually represent is not finished. The debate over the Black Sea flood theory is not finished. The connection between all of these threads and the 200 flood traditions scattered across the ancient world is not finished. The truth, whatever it is still down in the dark under that ridge, waiting for the next scan, the next core sample, the next reading from an instrument that might finally be precise enough to settle something that has been unsettled for 2,000 years. What makes this moment different from every other moment in the history of this search is the tools. Every previous investigation ran on some combination of faith, physical observation, and equipment that could not reach what needed to be reached. The current technology can read the interior of a formation in ways that were simply not possible before. The patterns the scans have returned are real patterns that require a real explanation, one way or the other. If the team is right that what they are seeing is structural, built rather than formed, then the implications extend far beyond a single archaeological find. They would require rethinking what humans were capable of building and when. What events were large enough to generate traditions across 200 unconnected cultures, and how much of what feels like mythology is actually memory. If the skeptics are right and the patterns have a geological explanation that just happens to look eerily organized, that answer also needs to be produced clearly and specifically, not just asserted. 2,000 years of dismissal without proof is not the same as disproof. The shape is in the ground. The scans have returned what they returned. The soil chemistry showed what it showed. The anchor stones are still sitting on that slope. The question of what all of it means is still the same question it has always been, just now with better instruments pointed at it than any previous generation had. The mystery beneath Mount Tenderek is far from settled. Every new scan, soil sample, and excavation brings fresh questions, not final answers. If the next breakthrough changes everything, you will want to see it first. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover history's greatest mysteries, one discovery at a time.